It all began on a crisp autumn morning when my mother-in-law, Susan, came over for her weekly visit. My son, Ethan, had just turned 3, and Susan had been eager to spend more time with him since his birthday. I remember that day vividly because it was the first time I noticed something off about Susan's behavior. As I busied myself in the kitchen preparing lunch, I could hear Ethan's gleeful laughter from the living room where he was playing with his grandmother. Curious, I peeked around the corner to catch a glimpse of their interaction. What I saw gave me pause. Susan was sitting on the floor with Ethan, surrounded by his colorful building blocks. But instead of the warm, doting expression I was used to seeing on her face, I noticed a strange, almost anxious look in her eyes. They darted around the room, never quite settling on Ethan for more than a few seconds. "Hey, you two," I called out, trying to sound casual. "Having fun?" Susan's head snapped up, and for a moment, I saw something akin to fear flash across her face. "Oh, yes, dear," she replied, her voice slightly strained. "Ethan is showing me his new blocks." I noticed her hands trembling slightly as she picked up a red block. At first, I dismissed it as nothing more than the natural shakiness that comes with age. After all, Susan was in her mid-60s. But as I continued to observe, I couldn't shake the feeling that something more was going on. Over the next few weeks, I paid closer attention to Susan's behavior around Ethan. Each time she visited, I noticed the same patterns: the restless eyes, the slight tremor in her hands, and an overall tension that seemed to envelop her whenever she was near my son. One afternoon, as Susan was helping Ethan put on his shoes for a trip to the park, I saw her struggle with the laces. Her fingers fumbled clumsily, and frustration clouded her features. "Here, let me help," I offered, moving towards them. "No," Susan snapped, then immediately softened her tone. "I mean, it's all right. I can manage." Ethan looked up at his grandmother, his little brow furrowed in confusion. "Grandma's hands are dancing," he said innocently. Susan laughed nervously and quickly finished tying his shoes. "There you go, sweetheart. All ready for the park." As we walked to the nearby playground, I couldn't help but notice how Susan kept a slight distance from Ethan, even when he reached for her hand. She seemed almost afraid to touch him, as if she might harm him somehow. At the park, I watched as Susan sat rigidly on a bench while Ethan played in the sandbox. Her eyes never left him, but there was a wariness in her gaze that I couldn't understand. When it was time to leave, she hesitated before helping Ethan out of the sandbox, her movements cautious and uncertain. That night, after Ethan was tucked in bed, I broached the subject with my husband, Mark. "Have you noticed anything different about your mom lately?" I asked hesitantly. Mark looked up from his laptop, a quizzical expression on his face. "Different how?" I sighed, trying to find the right words. "She seems, I don't know, anxious. Especially around Ethan. And her hands shake sometimes." Mark frowned. "Mom's always been a bit of a worrier. And the shaking, well, she's not as young as she used to be." "I know, but this feels different," I insisted. "It's like she's afraid of being around Ethan. Today at the park, she barely touched him." "Maybe she's just being careful," Mark suggested. "You know how kids can be at that age, always running around, easy to trip over." I nodded, not entirely convinced. "Maybe you're right. I just can't shake this feeling that there's more to it." Over the next few days, I found myself watching Susan even more closely. I noticed how she would sometimes pause mid-sentence, a look of confusion crossing her face before she continued speaking. How she would occasionally lose her balance for no apparent reason, catching herself on nearby furniture. One evening, as Susan was saying goodbye after dinner, I saw her reach out to hug Ethan, then hesitate and pat his head instead. The look of longing and fear in her eyes broke my heart. As I closed the door behind her, I couldn't help but feel a mix of concern and suspicion. Was it just the natural anxiety of a grandmother worried about her energetic grandson? Or was there something more serious going on that Susan wasn't telling us? I tried to rationalize it, telling myself that it was probably nothing. After all, becoming a grandparent can be a big adjustment. But deep down, a nagging voice kept insisting that there was more to Susan's strange behavior than met the eye. Something was wrong, and I was determined to figure out what it was, for Ethan's sake, for Susan's, and for our entire family's peace of mind. Weeks passed, and Susan's peculiar behavior around Ethan continued to gnaw at me. I found myself lying awake at night, replaying every interaction in my mind, searching for clues. The tension in our household was palpable, and I knew we couldn't go on like this indefinitely. One evening, after putting Ethan to bed, I decided it was time for a serious conversation with Mark. I found him in his study, poring over some work documents. "Mark," I said, my voice trembling slightly, "we need to talk about your mom." He looked up, his brow furrowed with concern. "What's wrong, Sarah?" I took a deep breath and poured out all my observations and fears. I told him about Susan's trembling hands, her anxious glances, and her reluctance to touch Ethan. As I spoke, I could see the worry lines deepening on Mark's face. I've noticed some things too," he admitted reluctantly. "Last week, when Mom was here for dinner, I saw her struggling to use her fork. She kept dropping it and then laughing it off. We talked late into the night, sharing our concerns and debating what to do. The idea that first crossed my mind seemed extreme, even to me. What if? I hesitated, then plunged ahead. What if we set up a hidden camera in the living room? Just for one day, when your mom is watching Ethan. Mark's eyes widened in shock. "Sarah, that's an invasion of privacy. We can't do that to my mother." I know, I said, feeling guilty even as I suggested it. "But Mark, what if something's really wrong? What if Ethan is in danger?" "In danger? From my mother?" Mark's voice rose incredulously. I reached out and took his hand. "I don't think Susan would ever intentionally harm Ethan. But what if she's sick? What if she has some condition that's affecting her ability to care for him safely?" Mark was silent for a long moment, conflict evident in his eyes. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Okay. One day. But if we don't see anything unusual, we take it down and never speak of this again." The next day, we purchased a small, discreet camera that could be hidden among the books on our living room shelf. As I set it up, my hands shook with nervousness and guilt. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were betraying Susan's trust. "Are we really doing the right thing?" I asked Mark as we tested the camera's feed on our laptop. He sighed heavily. "I don't know, Sarah. But if there's something wrong with Mom, we need to know. For her sake as much as Ethan's." We decided to put our plan into action the following Tuesday. Susan usually came over on Tuesdays to watch Ethan while I worked a half-day at the local library. That Monday night, I tossed and turned, unable to sleep. The weight of our decision pressed down on me like a physical force. I imagined Susan's hurt and betrayal if she ever found out about the camera. But then I'd remember the way her hands shook as she tried to help Ethan with his toys, and the fear would creep back in. Tuesday morning dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the turmoil in my heart. As I got Ethan ready for the day, I tried to act as normal as possible, but my smile felt forced and my laugh hollow. When Susan arrived, I greeted her with a hug, fighting back the guilt that threatened to overwhelm me. "Thanks for watching Ethan today, Susan. You're a lifesaver." She smiled, but I noticed the slight tremor in her lips. "Oh, it's my pleasure, dear. Ethan and I always have such fun together, don't we, sweetheart?" Ethan nodded enthusiastically, oblivious to the undercurrents of tension in the room. As I gathered my things to leave, I cast one last glance at the bookshelf where the camera was hidden. It was imperceptible unless you knew exactly where to look. "I'll be back around 2, I said, my voice sounding strained to my own ears. "Call me if you need anything at all." Susan waved me off. "We'll be fine. You go on now, don't worry about us." As I closed the front door behind me, I felt as if I was leaving a part of myself behind. The drive to work was a blur, my mind consumed with what might be happening at home. Would the camera reveal something sinister? Or would it show nothing more than a loving grandmother playing with her grandson? Throughout my shift at the library, I found myself checking my phone obsessively, half expecting a call from Susan or a neighbor reporting some disaster. But the hours ticked by uneventfully. When I finally pulled into our driveway that afternoon, my heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I took a moment to compose myself before entering the house, plastering on a smile as I opened the door. I'm home, I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally cheery to my own ears. Susan appeared from the kitchen, Ethan in tow. Welcome back, dear. We've had a lovely time, haven't we, Ethan? I hugged my son, searching his face for any signs of distress, but he seemed perfectly happy. As Susan gathered her things to leave, I felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Soon, we would have answers, but were they answers we really wanted? After Susan left, I stood in the living room, staring at the innocent-looking bookshelf that held our secret. The weight of what we'd done, and what we were about to discover, settled over me like a heavy blanket. With a deep breath, I steeled myself for what was to come. The morning arrived with a sense of foreboding. I woke up before the alarm, my stomach churning with anxiety. As I lay in bed, listening to Mark's steady breathing beside me, I couldn't help but wonder if we were making a terrible mistake. I went through my morning routine mechanically, my mind elsewhere as I prepared breakfast and got Ethan ready for the day. When Susan arrived, I forced a smile, trying to act as normal as possible. "Good morning, Susan," I said, my voice sounding strained even to my own ears. "Thanks again for watching Ethan today." Susan smiled warmly, though I noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she took off her coat. "It's my pleasure, dear. Ethan and I always have such wonderful times together." I knelt down to Ethan's level, giving him a tight hug. "Be good for Grandma, okay, sweetie?" I whispered, fighting back the urge to cancel everything and stay home. As I grabbed my purse and car keys, I cast one last glance at the bookshelf where the hidden camera sat, innocuously recording everything. The guilt threatened to overwhelm me, but I pushed it down. "I'll be back around 5, I called out, closing the door behind me. The drive to work was a blur. My mind raced with possibilities of what the camera might reveal. Would we see Susan struggling to care for Ethan? Or would it show nothing more than a loving grandmother doting on her grandson? The uncertainty was agonizing. At work, I found it nearly impossible to concentrate. My colleagues noticed my distraction, but I brushed off their concerns with vague excuses about not sleeping well. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart leaped into my throat, fearing it might be news about Ethan or Susan. "Sarah, are you sure you're all right?" my coworker, Lisa, asked during our lunch break. "You've been checking your phone every 2 minutes." I forced a laugh, trying to sound casual. "Oh, you know how it is with kids. I'm just a bit worried about Ethan. He's with his grandmother today." Lisa nodded sympathetically, but I could see the curiosity in her eyes. I quickly changed the subject, afraid I'd give away too much if we continued discussing it. The hours crawled by at an agonizing pace. By mid-afternoon, I was a bundle of nerves, barely able to focus on my work. When 5 o'clock finally arrived, I practically ran out of the office, my heart pounding with anticipation and fear. The drive home seemed to take forever. Every red light was an eternity, every slow driver an obstacle between me and the truth. As I pulled into our driveway, I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. I opened the front door, calling out with forced cheerfulness, "I'm home." Susan appeared from the kitchen, Ethan trailing behind her. "Welcome back, dear. We've had a lovely day, haven't we, Ethan?" Ethan nodded enthusiastically, running to give me a hug. I held him tightly, searching his face for any signs of distress, but he seemed perfectly happy and content. As Susan gathered her things to leave, I watched her closely, looking for any clues in her behavior. Her hands still trembled slightly as she put on her coat, but otherwise, she seemed normal. "Thank you so much for today, Susan," I said, giving her a hug goodbye. The guilt gnawed at me as I felt her frail body in my arms, knowing what we had done. "It's always a pleasure, dear," Susan replied warmly. "Ethan is such a joy to be around." As I closed the door behind her, I leaned against it, my heart racing. The moment of truth had arrived. I called out to Mark, who had just gotten home from work, "Can you watch Ethan for a bit? I need to check on something." Mark nodded, understanding in his eyes. He took Ethan to the backyard to play, leaving me alone with the hidden camera and its potentially life-changing footage. With trembling hands, I retrieved the camera from its hiding place and connected it to my laptop. As the video began to load, I felt a mix of dread and anticipation. Whatever I was about to see would change everything. The footage started playing, showing Susan and Ethan in the living room. At first, everything seemed normal. They were playing with blocks, reading stories, and having lunch. But as I continued watching, I noticed Susan's increasing agitation. Her hands shook more violently as the day progressed, and there were moments when she seemed to lose her train of thought mid-sentence. At one point, she nearly dropped Ethan while helping him onto the couch, catching herself at the last moment. But what truly shocked me came about halfway through the recording. Susan looked around furtively, as if making sure no one was watching. Then, with shaking hands, she reached into her purse and pulled out several prescription bottles. My heart pounded as I watched her struggle to open the containers, her fingers fumbling with the childproof caps. She quickly swallowed a handful of pills, then hurriedly put the bottles away as Ethan returned from the bathroom. I sat back, stunned. This wasn't at all what I had expected. Susan wasn't being neglectful or harmful to Ethan. She was hiding something from all of us. Something that was clearly affecting her health and ability to function normally. Tears welled up in my eyes as the realization hit me. We had invaded Susan's privacy, only to discover that she was battling something on her own, too afraid or ashamed to tell us. As the video came to an end, I heard Mark's footsteps approaching. I quickly wiped my eyes, trying to compose myself. How could I tell him what I had seen? How could we confront Susan about this without revealing our betrayal? The weight of this newfound knowledge pressed down on me. I knew that what we did next would change our family dynamic forever. As Mark entered the room, concern etched on his face, I took a deep breath, preparing myself for the difficult conversation ahead. As the video footage continued to play on my laptop screen, I felt a whirlwind of emotions: shock, confusion, and an overwhelming sense of guilt. What I was witnessing was far from what I had initially feared, yet it was equally heart-wrenching. "Sarah." Mark's voice startled me out of my trance. "What did you find?" I turned to face him, tears welling up in my eyes. "Mark, you need to see this," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He sat down beside me, his face etched with concern. As we watched the footage together, I could feel the tension radiating from him. When we reached the part where Susan took out her medication, Mark gasped audibly. "Oh, Mom," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. We continued watching in silence, taking in every detail. Susan's hands shook violently as she struggled with the pill bottles, her movements becoming increasingly uncoordinated as the day progressed. At one point, she nearly dropped a glass of water, catching it at the last second and glancing around nervously, as if afraid someone had seen her moment of weakness. What struck me most was the look in her eyes, a mixture of fear, determination, and sadness. It was clear that whatever she was dealing with, she was trying desperately to hide it from us. As the video came to an end, Mark and I sat in stunned silence for a few moments. "I can't believe it," Mark finally said, running his hands through his hair. "All this time, she's been... What do you think it is? Parkinson's?" I nodded slowly. "It looks like it could be. The tremors, the difficulty with fine motor skills. But Mark, why wouldn't she tell us?" He shook his head, looking lost. "I don't know. Maybe she's scared. Ashamed. God, Sarah, what have we done? We invaded her privacy, and for what?" The guilt that had been simmering inside me suddenly boiled over. "I'm so sorry, Mark. This was my idea. I thought. I don't know what I thought. I was just so worried about Ethan, and now..." Mark put his arm around me, pulling me close. "Hey, we're both responsible for this. We were trying to protect our son. We couldn't have known." We sat there for a while, trying to process what we'd discovered. The realization that Susan had been battling a serious illness in secret was overwhelming. All her strange behavior suddenly made sense: the trembling hands, the anxious looks, the reluctance to hold Ethan. She wasn't afraid of him, she was afraid of hurting him because of her condition. "We need to talk to her," I said finally, wiping away my tears. "We can't pretend we don't know about this." Mark nodded, his face a mask of worry. "But how? How do we tell her we've been spying on her?" The weight of our actions hung heavy in the air. We had crossed a line, and now we had to face the consequences. "Maybe," I began hesitantly. Maybe we don't tell her about the camera. We could say we noticed her symptoms and did some research. It's not entirely a lie. Mark considered this for a moment. I don't know, Sarah. Starting this conversation with more deception doesn't feel right. Deep down, I knew he was correct. We had already betrayed Susan's trust once. Doing it again would only make things worse. You're right, I admitted. We need to be honest, even if it means she'll be angry with us. She needs our support now more than ever. As we discussed how to approach Susan, I couldn't help but replay moments from the past few months in my mind. The times she had declined to babysit, saying she was too tired. The way she would sometimes pause mid-sentence, as if struggling to find the right words. It all made sense now, and I felt a wave of shame for not recognizing it sooner. We should invite her over for dinner tomorrow, Mark suggested. We'll talk to her after Ethan goes to bed. I nodded in agreement, already dreading the conversation to come. How would Susan react? Would she be able to forgive us for our invasion of her privacy? As we prepared for bed that night, the gravity of the situation weighed heavily on both of us. We had set out to uncover a potential threat to our son, only to discover a painful truth about someone we loved. The realization that Susan had been suffering in silence, afraid to burden us with her illness, was heartbreaking. Lying in bed, unable to sleep, I found myself replaying the footage in my mind. The image of Susan's trembling hands as she tried to play with Ethan, the look of determination on her face as she forced herself to appear normal, it all haunted me. Mark, I whispered into the darkness. Are you awake? Yeah, he replied, his voice thick with emotion. I can't stop thinking about Mom. All this time, she's been dealing with this alone. I reached out and took his hand. We'll be there for her now. Whatever she needs, we'll help her through this. As we lay there in the quiet of the night, I couldn't help but think about how quickly life can change. In the span of a day, our perception of Susan had been completely altered. The woman we thought we knew so well had been hiding a part of herself from us, struggling with a burden we couldn't even imagine. Tomorrow would bring a difficult conversation, one that would likely change our family dynamic forever. But as I finally drifted off to sleep, I felt a glimmer of hope. We had uncovered the truth, and now we could face it together as a family. Whatever challenges lay ahead, we would meet them with love, understanding, and support. The next evening arrived all too quickly. As I prepared dinner, my hands shook almost as badly as Susan's had in the video. Mark paced nervously in the living room, rehearsing what he wanted to say under his breath. The atmosphere in our house was thick with tension and anticipation. When the doorbell rang at 6:30 p.m., we both jumped. Mark went to answer it while I wiped my sweaty palms on my apron. Mom, welcome, I heard Mark say, his voice slightly strained. Come in, dinner's almost ready. Susan entered the kitchen, a warm smile on her face. Sarah, dear, it smells wonderful in here. What are we having? I turned to face her, forcing a smile. Just a simple roast chicken with vegetables. Nothing fancy. As we sat down to eat, the conversation was stilted and awkward. Ethan, oblivious to the tension, chatted happily about his day at preschool. I found myself studying Susan intently, noticing things I had overlooked before, the slight tremor in her hand as she lifted her fork, the way she sometimes paused before speaking, as if gathering her thoughts. After dinner, as I was clearing the table, Mark suggested, Mom, why don't you read Ethan a bedtime story while Sarah and I clean up? Susan's face lit up. I'd love to. Come on, Ethan, let's go pick out a book. As soon as they were out of earshot, Mark turned to me. Are you ready for this? I took a deep breath. As ready as I'll ever be. God, Mark, I feel sick about this whole thing. He squeezed my hand reassuringly. I know. But we have to do it. For Mom's sake. After we finished cleaning up, we sat in the living room, waiting for Susan to come back downstairs. The minutes ticked by agonizingly slowly. Finally, we heard her soft footsteps on the stairs. Ethan's all tucked in, she said, smiling as she entered the room. But her smile faltered when she saw our serious expressions. Is everything all right? Mark cleared his throat. Mom, we need to talk to you about something important. Susan's face paled slightly, but she sat down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "What is it?" I couldn't bear the suspense any longer. The words tumbled out of me in a rush. "Susan, we know about your condition. We've noticed the tremors, the difficulty with coordination. We're so sorry you've been dealing with this alone." Susan's eyes widened in shock, then filled with tears. How did you know?" This was the moment of truth. Mark and I exchanged a glance, and he nodded slightly. We did something we're not proud of," I admitted, my voice shaking. "We were worried about your behavior around Ethan, so we set up a hidden camera yesterday when you were babysitting." The room fell silent. Susan's face went through a range of emotions: shock, hurt, anger, and finally, a deep sadness. "You spied on me," she whispered, her voice trembling. Mark leaned forward, his eyes pleading. "Mom, we're so sorry. We were worried about Ethan's safety, but we should have just talked to you. Can you forgive us?" Susan was quiet for a long moment, tears streaming down her face. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. I was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease 6 months ago. I didn't want to tell anyone. I thought I could handle it on my own." My heart broke for her. I moved to sit beside her on the couch, taking her trembling hands in mine. "Oh, Susan, why didn't you tell us? We could have helped you." She shook her head, wiping away tears. "I didn't want to be a burden. I was afraid you wouldn't let me see Ethan anymore if you knew. He's my whole world." Mark knelt in front of his mother, his own eyes glistening with tears. "Mom, you could never be a burden to us. We love you. We want to support you through this." Susan looked at us both, her expression a mixture of relief and lingering hurt. "I'm sorry I kept this from you. I was just so scared." We spent the next few hours talking, really talking, for the first time in months. Susan told us about her diagnosis, her fears, and the daily struggles she'd been facing alone. We listened, offering comfort and support, promising to be there for her every step of the way. As the night wore on, I felt the tension in the room slowly dissipate. There were more tears, but also moments of laughter as we reminisced about happier times and made plans for the future. "We'll need to make some changes," Mark said, his voice filled with determination. "We'll research the best treatments, find support groups. Whatever you need, Mom, we're here for you." Susan nodded, a small smile on her face. "Thank you. I'm sorry I didn't trust you with this sooner." I squeezed her hand gently. "We're sorry too, Susan. What we did was wrong, even if our intentions were good. Can you forgive us?" She looked at us both for a long moment, then nodded. "Of course I forgive you. You're my family. We'll get through this together." As Susan prepared to leave that night, I hugged her tightly. "No more secrets, okay? We're in this together now." She hugged me back, her embrace stronger than I expected. "No more secrets," she agreed. Watching her drive away, I felt a mix of emotions: relief, sadness, but also hope. We had uncovered a painful truth, but in doing so, we had also strengthened our family bonds in ways I never thought possible. That night, as Mark and I lay in bed, exhausted but relieved, I turned to him and said, "You know, as terrible as this whole situation was, I think it might have brought us all closer together." He nodded, pulling me close. "I think you're right. We've got a long road ahead, but at least now we're all on it together." As I drifted off to sleep, I realized that sometimes, the most difficult moments in life can also be the most transformative. We had started this journey out of fear and suspicion, but we were ending it with a renewed sense of love, understanding, and family unity.